Welcome, everybody, to the final lecture in our summer series. This is the ninth lecture in the Rare Book School summer series. My name is Michael Suarez. I'm the Executive Director of Rare Book School, and it's my privilege to welcome you, both the online audience as well as those who are here in the Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Auditorium. I think you're in for a real treat this evening. Uh, Tonight we have the first named lecture of Rare Book School, which has a venerable tradition, as you will hear, the Malkin lecture. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the eponymous benefactors, if I may. The Saul M. and Mary Ann O'Brien Malkin Lecture in Bibliography is named for the two founding editors of A.B. Bookman's Weekly, which from 1948 to 1999 was among the most important journals in the antiquarian book-selling world. In 1984, Mary Ann Malkin began to support an annual Rare Book School lecture in honor of her husband, Saul Malkin, in recognition of his contributions to the antiquarian book trade. Michael Winship gave the first Saul M. Malkin Lecture in Bibliography at Columbia University in December of 1985. Although Saul died in 1986, Mary Ann continued to support Rare Book School both at Columbia and then when the school moved here at the University of Virginia. In the late 1990s, she allowed the Rare Book School founding director, Terry Bellinger, to change the name of the lecture to the Saul M. and Mary Ann O'Brien Malkin Lecture in Bibliography. At her death in 2005, Mary Ann left the school a significant portion of her estate. She was truly a friend of Rare Book School, and it's a great privilege to honor her memory in this ongoing way. Malkin lecturers over the years have included such luminaries as Greer Allen, Nicholas Barker, Bill Barlow, Bob Darnton, Miriam Foote, Christopher DeHamel, Jim Green, Selby Kiefer, Catherine Keyes-Lieb, Paul Needham, Bill Reese, and Marjorie Wynne, among many other luminaries. Joining their ranks as this year's Malkin lecturer is the distinguished scholar Christopher Warren, and it is my great pleasure to introduce him to you now. Christopher Warren is professor of English and history and incoming head of English at Carnegie Mellon University. His previous posts have included teaching positions and research fellowships at Oxford University, University College London Centre for Editing Lives and Letters, the National University of Ireland Galway's Moore Institute, and the University of Chicago. Professor Warren is the author of, inter alia, Literature and the Law of Nations, 1580 to 1680, published by Oxford University Press, which was awarded the 2016 Roland H. Bainton Prize for Literature. Studies in English literature called it, quote, a major achievement. Warren offers a magisterial account of how early modern literary genres inflected the discourses of modern international law. My only gripe with the book is that although Grotius and Pufendorf make important appearances, Suarez is terribly underrepresented. More on that over dinner, sir. A former member of the Modern Language Association's Executive Committee for 17th Century English, Warren co-founded 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon and directed the National Endowment for the Humanities-funded Digital Humanities Project Freedom and the Press before Freedom of the Press, which used machine learning, which we'll hear about tonight, and artificial intelligence, ditto, to discover and center the anonymous craftsmen and women responsible for printing controversial clandestine materials. Active in humanities advocacy through the National Humanities Alliance, Professor Warren is inspired by real-world humanities problems, such as funding for humanities research, how germane is that, and access to books and archives. His research spans digital humanities, law and literature, political theory, early modern literature, print culture, and the history of political thought. We are honored to have him among us this evening to deliver the Saul M. and Marianne O'Brien Malkin Lecture. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Warren.
Thank you, Michael, for that absolutely overly generous introduction. Before I start, I want to thank the Rare Book School for this very kind invitation. Michael, of course, and Katie and Kim have been tremendous in helping with the logistics. So, book historians have long faced a methodological dilemma. Do we want to study particular material objects in granular detail, or are we primarily concerned with more general patterns, patterns connected to larger questions about, say, politics, economics, censorship regimes, or ideology? While not strictly exclusive, these two approaches nevertheless exist in tension, and scholars frequently orient themselves towards one side or another. In what follows today, I want to explore how the new field of computational bibliography is helping to resolve this dilemma through its ability to connect granular material details to larger, more consequential patterns. Computational bibliography, I want to argue, makes it newly possible to move fluidly between scales, bringing into focus material features like individual type sorts and paper stocks, while also uncovering large-scale clandestine printing campaigns and historical print networks. Dynamic scaling made possible by computational bibliography, then, is not merely a technical convenience, but a methodological breakthrough, one that enables book historians to ask and answer fascinating new questions. To get to the heart of book historians' long-standing dilemma, one could do worse than to start with the mid-20th century debate between two Anglophone scholars on opposite sides of the Atlantic. The American 𝗧𝗹𝗸 Hinman was relatively fresh off intelligence service in World War II and the Korean War when he published his monumental two-volume work, The Printing and Proofreading of Shakespeare's First Folio, 1963. New Zealander D.F. Mackenzie was at this point midway toward his Cambridge PhD, soon published in two volumes in 1966 as the Cambridge University Press, 1676 to 1712, a bibliographical study. Hinman's printing and proofreading was a monument to microscopy. By attending in astonishing detail to the material particularities of a single edition, type sorts, running titles, brass rules, etc., Hinman revealed a vast amount about the processes and procedures involved as printers Isaac and William Jaggard, with their various pressmen and compositors, created Shakespeare's First Folio. Like Carlo Ginzburg's The Cheese and the Worms of 1976, or Natalie Zeman Davis's Return of Martin Guerre of 1983, Hinman's bibliographic work exhibited faith in the power of small details, in the anomalous and the particular. However, unlike those microhistories, which of course had yet to be written, Hinman started from the material object and only strayed beyond it long enough to suggest that certain features of the Jaggard print shop typified any letterpress print shop of the period. He also adopted a notably scientific rhetoric through his many references to amassing and analyzing bibliographic data. Underlying this approach had been his invention of the now famous Hinman collator, a technology using light and mirrors that allowed Hinman to compare two copies of an edition side by side in such a way that small typographic and orthographic differences between copies flickered before the eye. This, he boasted, contributed to what he called his, quote, large-scale bibliographical investigation. Mackenzie's nearly concurrent work with the Cambridge University Archives revealed equally as much about the history of Cambridge University Press, but it also demonstrated Mackenzie's distrust of Hinman's methods. Large scale was hardly a description of Hinman's approach that Mackenzie could endorse. Although Hinman went unnamed in Mackenzie's preface, Hinman's work had certainly caught Mackenzie's attention. Most obviously, Hinman's seemingly maniacal focus on a single edition missed opportunities to develop a more holistic understanding of the book trade. According to Mackenzie, seemingly commenting with Hinman in mind, his own studies, quote, basic demonstration that the organization of work on any one book is meaningful only in relation to the work of the printing house as a whole, suggests that the context of much bibliographical analysis needs to be somewhat wider than it has been. Wider than it has been. This was microscopy as myopia. Even more worryingly to Mackenzie, Hinman's N of 1 did not stop Hinman from making broader declarations about general print shop practices. Hinman's predilections for a science of bibliography notwithstanding, inductive inference from a single example was, at least in Mackenzie's view, hardly worthy of that honorific. In his influential 1969 essay, Printers of the Mind, Mackenzie would excoriate Hinman by name for suggesting his claims extended beyond the particularities of the Shakespeare First Folio. Mackenzie used Printers of the Mind to make the broader point that, quote, productive conditions were constantly changing, not just from century to century in different houses, but from day to day in the same house. It's rarely noted in accounts of their differences, but Hinman would ultimately go on record to agree with Mackenzie's critique. In a conference paper delivered at the World Shakespeare Congress in 1971, Hinman responded to what he himself called Mackenzie's, quote, devastating attack in Printers of the Mind by acknowledging that he had, quote, indeed been guilty of unwarranted statements about what normal Elizabethan practice was, and that, quote, at least most of what Mackenzie says in Printers of the Mind is absolutely right. Although Hinman himself never put it in the following way, it's hard to resist the sense that Hinman's detailed attention to a single edition trapped him in a cycle of learning more and more about less and less. Even as his self-described large-scale bibliographic investigation produced loads and loads of, quote, wholly new evidence, generalizations about the book trade necessarily remained out of reach. In terms of conclusions, Shakespeare's First Folio became something like Hinman's personal Hotel California. He could check in, but he could never leave. And yet Mackenzie's competing vision of the sociology of the text had its own blind spots. In some ways, Mackenzie was Hinman's mirror image. Mackenzie himself roamed widely, discovering and analyzing major documents related to the 17th century English book trade and masterfully revealing the vexed sociocultural history of New Zealand's Treaty of Waitangi, but never settled down with a bibliographical artifact the way Hinman had done. If Hinman was a long-term resident of the First Folio's Hotel California, Mackenzie was something of a traveling salesman who never unpacked his bags. Mackenzie himself acknowledged that his own study of Cambridge University Press, quote, could be refined greatly by close analytical study of the books themselves. This was a telling admission. Floating above the books themselves would be a durable feature of Mackenzie's career. None of this is to say, of course, that Hinman hadn't been fully capable of developing a more general sociology of early modern printing, nor that Mackenzie, great champion of the sociology of the text, couldn't himself had analyzed damaged type in any one of hundreds of thousands of early modern editions. He was a marvelous editor of Congreve. Yet each had a particular disposition and practiced bibliography in a way that's given inspiration to many scholars in their footsteps. On the one side, there's forensics, detail, particularity, materiality. On the other side, scale, society, sociology, politics, and ideology. The gulf between these two approaches has been vast. Hinman's allies, like Thomas Tansell, have grumbled that book history's recent popularity, quote, has often caused it to attract practitioners who have no background in the study of the physical book, while some Mackenzie devotees feel, quote, impatient with the empirical zeal to which certain book culture scholars are devoted. The division's mostly amicable, but it's a division nonetheless. So far, I've been using Hinman and Mackenzie somewhat cartoonishly to illustrate wider tensions in book history. But it's important to emphasize that these tensions aren't entirely reducible to differences between the UVA and Oxbridge bibliographical traditions. In Robert Darnton's Introduction to the Business of Enlightenment, several years before his groundbreaking essay, what is the history of the book? The great historian of revolutionary France pointed to the methodological differences between French practitioners of the Histoire du Livre, who emphasized structural and sociological developments, and the so-called British emphasis on the processes by which books were produced and distributed that included, and here effectively clumping Hinman and Mackenzie, pursuing their quarry into the account books of publishers and the ledgers of booksellers. For Darnton, bibliography's exit from Hotel California could be found through French scholarship, proposing a distinctly American method fusing French and British traditions. Maybe Hinman and Mackenzie were both honorary Brits. Darnton endeavored to rescue Anglophone bibliography from its own worst excesses by leavening it with analyst Histoire du Livre and demonstrating in the process bibliography's import for those, quote, ordinary meat and potatoes historians otherwise alienated by problems such as how consistently compositor B misspelled the text of The Merchant of Venice. On its own terms, Darnton's work has been enormously influential. But my point here is that the tension he identified between the French and Anglophone scholarly traditions mirrored almost exactly the structure of the Hinman-Mackenzie debate, albeit projected onto national categories. Here it was English language bibliography that stood in for the minute, the particular, the antiquarian, the picayune, and ultimately limited scholarly significance. French bibliography was the Mackenzian rejoinder, macroscopic, ambitious, and politically engaged, and yet sadly insufficient for grappling with the materiality of physical books. So here we've got two versions of what amounts to be the same problem, specifically the problem of scale. Look too close, you can't see or possibly even imagine the bigger picture. Zoom out too far, you obscure layer upon layer of craft, agency, and detail. Framed in this way, it's hardly surprising that the field has bifurcated. For one thing, you can't have it all. Pick your poison. But bibliography also exists in a much wider scholarly landscape characterized by longstanding debates over inductive versus deductive methods. Whether one finds it preferable to begin with the particular to reason about the general, or to start with the general as a way of understanding the particular, depends to a large degree on one's working theory of how knowledge is created. At the outer edges of those approaches are two equally extreme dogmas: that there are only particulars, no general patterns, and that all particulars are governed by a single overarching rule, like capitalism. Scholarship in the presence of such dogmas, then, occasionally takes a reactionary turn, the motivated desire to categorize all putatively unique cases under some predetermined theory, or, by contrast, an antiquarian fetishization of particularity and minute detail, perhaps for its own sake, but often to frustrate would-be generalizers. Now, the point I've been building up to with all this talk of tensions and divisions in book history is that what I want to call computational bibliography gives us a new trading zone for these traditions to intermingle. What do I mean by computational bibliography, which is, after all, now a less familiar term than the conjunction digital humanities in book history, or even digital book history, or digital bibliography? I want to identify two strands of computational bibliography and discuss how they relate to one another. Let's go back to Hinman and Mackenzie. Mackenzie's explicit project in bibliography and the sociology of texts was not only to widen the scope of book-based bibliography to include the social, economic, and political motivations of publishing, but also to expand bibliography to include, quote, physical forms, all physical forms which mediate meaning. Archives, libraries, and databanks, Mackenzie insisted, were all made up of bibliographical objects. Strikingly, Mackenzie even counted the computer itself as a kind of book. Computational bibliography in this sense is bibliography conceived as a mode of analyzing physical objects trained on the medium of the computer rather than the codex. This line of thinking has produced magnificent, important studies, such as those by Matthew Kirschenbaum, Whitney Trettine, Matty Burkert, and Alan Gailey, among others, many shading into what have been called media archaeology and digital forensics. It's an approach that I've previously undertaken in a study of the making of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Taking inspiration from bibliographers' historical expertise in the technical procedures of book manufacturing, Such studies typically lay bare the otherwise obscure technical processes and protocols underlying born digital objects, like ebooks, web pages, and digital images. As 𝗧𝗹𝗸 has put it, a scholar working with born digital materials must needs be conversant in the antiquarian cants of vanished operating systems, file formats, and data structures, as well as tools like hex viewers and emulators, just as we expect an early modernist doing book history to know something of formats, signatures, and collation formulae. There's, of course, a certain irony that Mackenzie's call for a bibliography for computer-stored information would lead back to approaches that seem, in important ways, like Hinman's own. While Mackenzie opened the door for a bibliography equal to its technological moment, computational bibliography in this sense operates as something we might call computational Hinmanism, which is to say, in full admiration, an approach dedicated to reverse engineering and analyzing the various methods and components of digital inscription, storage, and the transmission through a staunchly materialist lens. Oriented to particular artifacts, in much the same way Hinman devoted his energies to Shakespeare's First Folio, computational Hinmanism trains its sights on artifacts like the beloved 3.doc file among Toni Morrison's 5¼ inch diskettes. Ironies aside, I want to claim that there's further potential in computational bibliography. In other words, we need not set aside the broader historical ambitions articulated by Mackenzie and Darnton to use bibliography as a lever for prying open larger scale questions about politics, economics, censorship, and ideology. Here, in the second meaning, the weight of computational in computational bibliography falls less on the object of analysis than on the method. Computation as a repertoire of models and programmable procedures applicable at various scales. Speaking in his Panizzi lectures of the lecture's namesake, Anthony Panizzi, Mackenzie quoted a complimentary BBC documentary to say, "I think if Panizzi were alive today, as I say to some of my more traditionally minded colleagues, he would be more radical, more adventurous, more outward-looking, have the biggest computer of the lot. He was a man for change and adaptation, as well as a man for tradition." What I take this to mean is that Mackenzie saw the computer not just as a physical device for mediating meaning, but as an aid for advancing his expansive view of historical and analytic bibliography. Like the Hinman collator, the computer facilitates bibliographical discoveries, but with an important added dimension. It opens more readily into more fertile fields of historical and sociological import. That Robert Darnton, who became a great admirer of Mackenzie's, saw similar promise in computation can be seen in his early 2010s advocacy for the Digital Public Library of America, which he saw as opening the way to a general transformation of the landscape in what we now call the information society. And more recently, the application of his own model of the communications circuit to the politics and economics of contemporary scholarly publishing, in particular, the complex interactions among scholars, libraries, commercial publishers, regulatory regimes, and internet protocols. In a 2012 review, Darnton showered praise on Simon Burroughs' online French book trade in early Enlightenment Europe database, highlighting especially the database's, quote, potential relevance to some important historical questions. This is computational bibliography for history's meat and potatoes craft. Darnton certainly appreciates that the site's design and engineering belong to the current flourishing of the digital humanities. That is, the study of cultural data that can be aggregated on a large scale, broken down into pertinent units, recombined to bring out hidden relations and expressed visually thanks to the latest advances in information technology. What matters most, however, is that bibliography can serve as a catalyst for precisely the kinds of inquiries that social historians like Darnton had long prioritized. Far from shunting us into esoteric matters of how texts became embedded in paper as typographical signs and transmitted to readers as pages found in books, the bibliography represented by FBTEE invites new kinds of questions about censorship, commerce, ideology, and the like that non-computational analytic methods could not so easily expose. It recasts the bibliographer using computers not just as a forensic analyst of digital artifacts, but as a builder of interpretive engines. What Burroughs and his collaborators had achieved then was a concrete demonstration of how computational bibliography could help historians make meaning. Since this too is a strain of computational bibliography that I partly want to attach myself to in what follows, let me just mention a few more examples of this version of computational bibliography. Call it computational Darntonism. Ambitions to capture historical changes are similarly at work in what Mikko Tolvanen and his collaborators in the Helsinki Computational History Group term bibliographical data science, by which they mean the computational analysis of cataloging metadata to study diachronic questions like changing proportions of book formats and rates and geographies of vernacularization. Cataloging metadata is also at the heart of what Ryan Cordell calls speculative bibliography. His viral text project with David Smith algorithmically crawls millions of digitized 19th century newspaper images to find likely examples of textual reuse. As a result, textual reuse becomes a metadata category algorithmically superimposed on newspaper articles that is then used to, quote, map relationships among documents that sort and organize the digital archive into related sets. What makes this speculative for Cordell are the fallible computational and probabilistic methods that model similarity and do the sorting. What makes it bibliography is that, quote, such methods belong to the textual systems they transform and should themselves be described with the same rigor that bibliographers and book historians describe historical technologies of knowledge production. Melanie Walsh's investigation of proprietary book sale data extends such concerns into the present day, although here, Walsh's inability to access, much less computationally process, contemporary book sales data reveals how control over certain metadata has shifted from public scholarly and bibliographic institutions to private commercial platforms. For Walsh, detailing which large-scale bibliographic data can't be analyzed via data science because it's locked behind paywalls, protected by NDAs, or structurally inaccessible, becomes a kind of computational bibliography of shadows, a way of sketching the shapes of absent data and identifying the political, cultural, and economic conditions responsible for those shapes. What all of these examples have in common, I would say, is a drive towards synopsis, a drive that differs in important ways from the more forensic approaches, and instead aims to see things altogether, as the etymology of synopsis would have it. So far, I've identified two strains of computational bibliography, both in some sense prefigured by Mackenzie, that we can refer to by shorthand as computational Hinmanism and computational Darntonism. But what's truly exciting about computational bibliography, in my mind, is the way these two strains can be brought together, and that researchers can move fluidly between the two scales. Computational bibliography isn't a tool only for recovering obscure digital material or for analyzing large data sets. It's also a means of connecting different kinds of evidence and levels of analysis. Robert Darnton loved that the FBTE project makes it possible to enjoy a broad overview of trade patterns and to zoom in to individual sites where one can assess the relative importance of factors such as trade routes, political barriers, and cultural institutions. In a moment, I'm going to give some additional examples of zooming between scales from my own work on the Collaborative Print and Probability Project. But first, I want to comment broadly on what I take to be the crucial interface between the micro and the macro level computational bibliographies: modeling. In a 1992 address to the London Bibliographical Society, D.F. Mackenzie prophesied, "The future of bibliography may come to be profoundly influenced not by the storage capacity of computers, but by their capacity for modeling." I contend that Mackenzie had it exactly right. Modeling, understood here following Willard McCarty as the heuristic process of building and manipulating simplified representations for the purpose of study or discovery, is the practice that allows computational bibliography to move between individual artifacts and broader patterns. The implied distinction between the computer as a kind of Hinman collator on steroids and the computer as a modeling engine recalls the broader divide between inductive and deductive methods that Mackenzie and Hinman represent. Models by design aim to take in the whole. They flounder on anomalies, they abstract particulars, and they risk falsification. And yet their value lies in that very ambition, to account for patterns that might otherwise go unrecognized. For Mackenzie, we can assume computation's promise lay in its potential to make bibliographical hypotheses explicit and testable. As the famous bibliographer Janis Joplin might have said, model's just another word for something left to prove. Mackenzie may not have known it, but his 1992 remarks coincided almost exactly with the first International Conference on Document Analysis and Recognition, or ICDAR, a computer science community that, in its own way, took up his challenge. Over the following years, ICDAR proceedings included papers with titles like Understanding Structured Text Documents by a Model-Driven Approach, Page Grammars and Page Parsing, and this is my favorite, Don't Tell Mom I'm Doing Document Analysis, She Believes I'm in the Computer Vision Field. While the ICDAR community focused on technical domains like optical character recognition and page segmentation, it was the first to devote itself fully to modeling the physical structure of documents, fonts, layouts, and the visual grammars of printed material. These early efforts, though rarely cited in book history, have quietly shaped the computational approaches bibliographers are now beginning to build on and extend. As I turn now to my own work on our print and probability project, I would emphasize that modeling sits at its very center. You'll see here a slide of our many collaborators who deserve acknowledgement and recognition. Print and probability began almost a decade ago as a collaboration between myself and statistician Max 𝗧𝗹𝗑, and soon came to include computer scientist Taylor Burr-Kirkpatrick, special collections librarian Sam Lemley, and a host of graduate students and external collaborators. Our core mission is to identify the printers of clandestine early modern books and pamphlets. To the extent that we do computational bibliography, it's only because computers are enormously helpful in that pursuit. For those unfamiliar with this type of scholarship, historians care about the history of book production for many of the same reasons social scientists care about IP addresses, MD5 hashes, bot networks, deep fakes, and media ownership. To understand things like the cultural diffusion of knowledge, propaganda and misinformation, communication under censorship, and authoritative versions of documents. In addition to these general interests, what motivates our work in particular is an empirical observation combined with a simple but powerful Darntonian proposition about the history of ideas. The empirical observation, generated by analyzing bibliographical metadata at scale, is the somewhat astonishing fact that up to 70% of all letterpress books, pamphlets, and broadsides printed between 1450 and 1800 remain unattributed. I would just say, as an aside, this feels a little bit like not knowing who owns Fox News or the New York Post, and especially not knowing that it's Rupert Murdoch in both cases. The proposition that sort of generates this sort of study is that printers of clandestine materials are the latent variables in the history of ideas. Sometimes I like to combine these two into the following couplet. Here's some poetry for you. We don't know enough about who printed old stuff. The reason I say that modeling sits at the very center of the project is that we're developing novel machine learning methods that can detect and integrate hidden sources of information in letterpress books to uncover the people and processes involved in secret printing. In prior work, we've used distinctively damaged letterpress type pieces to uncover a sophisticated ideological program of clandestine printing in the mid-17th century, one that produced several of the most famous and significant tracts relating to freedom of the press and freedom of conscience. We've used that same method in part to falsify an existing attribution of one of the so-called first editions of Hobbes's Leviathan, and to reattribute the edition to a different printer, and to identify two previously unknown printers of Shakespeare's Fourth Folio. We currently have extremely exciting work underway relating to the first English translation of Spinoza's theological political treatise and John Locke's two treatises of government that I'll speak about in a minute. But first, how does modeling help? Having a spine. Consider US patent number 7,500,008,979, filed in 2004 by Google. At first glance, the first figure in the patent, a diagram of folded gatherings bound at the spine, looks unremarkable, especially to bibliographers. But it was at the heart of Google's extraordinary ambition to turn books into data. Google asserted that while the web was easily searchable, an enormous portion of human knowledge was locked inside printed books. Books with spines that curved, resisted flattening, and introduced distortions into scanned images. These distortions, they found, were serious impediments to OCR. the patent proposed a technical solution, a way of capturing and correcting for the 3D geometry of books to produce cleaner, two-dimensional, machine-readable images. In effect, Google had to model the physical structure of the book in order to digitize its contents. Having modeled their way into flat searchable images, the path was open for further abstraction, search, retrieval, n-grams, and eventually the large language models like ChatGPT and Gemini that have been trained on such data. But these early models started with the spine, with the very thing that made a book, and not just a sequence of words. Our project depends entirely on digitized images, captured in ways not so different from Google's. What we do with them, though, extends in a very different direction, and I should add a less lucrative one. We break page images down into their constituent letters or sorts. It's a process Charlton Hinman might have described as creating large-scale bibliographical data, but I prefer to think of it as mincing words. Mincing, of course, is the kitchen technique of chopping as finely as possible, often to intensify flavor. The term carries with it a long history of feminized associations, of delicacy, refinement, and taste, whether describing food preparation or a dainty mincing walk. But it offers a useful counterpoint to the masculinized language that often surrounds digital work at scale. At this point, I'm a little sheepish about repeating Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio's term from data feminism, big dick data, but I think it's apt. To be sure, we are interested in scale. We identify clandestine printers. To identify clandestine printers, we've developed algorithms that reverse engineer the printing process, decomposing digitized books into hundreds of thousands of individual type impressions. At last count, we had segmented and stored roughly 280 million impressions from nearly 2,000 early modern books. But what matters is not just the volume, but the method. Mincing in the culinary sense isn't about making more things or simply making things smaller. Mincing's payoff is that it exposes more surface areas, creating exponentially more sites for ingredients to exchange flavors. So too with our bibliographical mincing. This level of segmentation doesn't simply increase the size of our data set, it reveals otherwise invisible structures. By isolating individual type impressions, we expose the typographic surfaces typically encapsulated inside larger semantic units like words, or material units like lines, pages, or sheets. These impressions, once disaggregated, help reveal relationships among printers, presses, and political networks that would remain hidden in aggregated form. Mincing in this context allows us to trace the material labors of bookwork in Whitney Trittine's sense, and to register how those labors intersect with questions of censorship and the history of ideas. It's a method that honors both the grain of the material and the subtleties of bibliographic evidence. You might say that mincing words in a culinary sense clarifies what was at stake in mincing words in the socio-political sense, the careful compromises printers made under conditions of censorship, and the typographic traces they left behind. To make sense of all this minced material, we needed a tool capable of helping us sort like with like, to unmake the salad, as it were. That tool is Ocular, a historical OCR system originally developed by Taylor Burke Kirkpatrick and his collaborators in the early 2010s. Designed to handle noisy documents, mixed languages, and inconsistent typographic conventions, Ocular offers a significant advance over traditional OCR systems because it learns distinctive visual characteristics of historical type, even when those characteristics include broken, damaged, or non-standard letter forms. Unlike conventional OCR engines, which often rely on rigid templates or heavily supervised training data, Ocular works more like a bibliographer. It studies a collection of images and builds probabilistic models of fonts, spacing, inking, and spelling variation. These models then generate diplomatic transcriptions. In other words, Ocular tells us what it thinks a page says based on its model of how that page was printed. Ocular is an essential step in our research pipeline. Faced with hundreds of millions of segmented impressions, we used it not to transcribe whole documents, but to cluster and compare images of the same character. In an unexpected twist, Ocular's occasional difficulties in categorizing images also comes in handy. Remember, model's just another name for something left to prove. Because ocular classifies letters probabilistically, low probabilities and erroneous classifications can be possible signals of damaged type. But apart from those felicitous errors, how else could we find damaged type among 280 million character images? Modeling again. To tackle this challenge, we needed to formalize in computational terms the kinds of typographical features historical bibliographers are trained to recognize: bends, fractures, over-inking, under-inking. We began with undamaged examples, and then algorithmically introduced localized deformations that reproduce what one might expect from a dropped typepiece or an uneven press strike. Success meant images of damaged type that looked plausible to the trained bibliographic eye, which could then be generated in sufficient quantity to train a machine learning model. Character images in our pipeline are now given what we call damage scores, which are probabilistic assessments of distinctiveness and damage. As a quick digression here, thanks to a recent Digital Humanities Advancement Grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, you can now browse over 15,000 examples of damaged type at our catalog of distinctive type for Restoration England. You can start with a printer or with a letter form, and you'll see all characters associated with that printer or all of a given character from all printers. A list view will show some metadata, including unique IDs, the source book, and because we store page coordinates for every letter, the opportunity to see the letter in its full context via zoomable 𝗧𝗹𝗸 presentation. But once we had ways to synthesize and then to recognize damaged type, the next and far more difficult step was to identify other impressions across the corpus that bore the same unique damage. At first glance, this might seem like a simple image search task, but it's actually the inverse of what most image matching systems are designed to do. Traditional image similarity metrics are built to tolerate minor differences in lighting, alignment, or background noise while preserving broad visual features. If you think about this like how self-driving cars are trained, you want to know that it's a stop sign, whether you're looking at it from this direction or that direction. It doesn't matter if there's something else that makes it unique. What matters is that it's a stop sign. We needed a system that would do the opposite: ignore large-scale differences in printing and scanning, while remaining exquisitely sensitive to tiny localized scars on metal type. Computationally, this meant defining a distance function between character images that would give low scores to characters that look broadly similar and high scores only when they shared the same specific pattern of damage. To do this, we generated synthetic training data, taking clean character images, introducing matched artificial damage to each member of a pair, and adding plausible distortions drawn from real printing noise. This allowed the model to learn which differences to ignore and which to treat as significant. But getting the system to work took many iterations, new network architectures, new alignment strategies, new methods of simulating defects, before we could reliably locate type impressions with shared damage across large and noisy corpora. With slightly different procedures, we created a parallel method for larger titling fonts. Success at these stages introduced exciting new challenges. For example, how might we test whether printers produced a given book or pamphlet in multiple shops to distribute risk and better evade detection? Sheets that included impressions from the same pieces of damaged type could reasonably be assumed to have been printed in the same shop. Yet the digitization process that turned folded three-dimensional sheets into flat two-dimensional page images obscured crucial information about imposition and collation. To recover that structure computationally, we turned our attention to static typographic elements that remained fixed across multiple pages, such as the running title set in skeleton forms. Our models implemented the assumption that by clustering these repeated elements and mapping them back to sheet size and gatherings, we could partially reconstruct the hidden logic of book assembly. This allowed us to identify cases where multiple skeleton forms were used in parallel, suggesting multiple presses at work, or where a form had been reset mid-run, potentially in response to censorship. Modeling color also became a source of bibliographical evidence. Using a free online tool we developed called the Coloring Book, we analyzed the average paper color of digitized images from 𝗧𝗹𝗸-enabled repositories, such as the Internet Archive. Users draw a small rectangle, typically in the margin, and the tool samples that same region across every page, calculating mean RGB values to allow for comparison throughout the book. Sudden shifts in tone, often imperceptible in PDFs or reading rooms, can signal different paper stocks, print events, or late insertions of illicit material. This analysis depends on several modeled assumptions. We treat the selected rectangle as a stable coordinate across all pages and interpret the extracted color as proxy evidence of material difference. IIIF manifest provides structured access to high-resolution scans, but we still need to account for how physical artifacts become pixel data, how light, wear, and texture shape what we see. The result is a tool that turns average color into metadata, offering new ways to investigate how books were made, modified, or digitized. Okay, now I want to zoom back out. This diagram distills the methodological continuum I've been tracing, what we might call a spectrum between computational Hinmanism and computational Darntonism. On the one end, in the red, we begin not with a book as a finished object, but with its elemental components. Sorts, the individual type pieces that leave impressions on the page. From there, we follow the material structure of print. Sorts combine into pages, pages into forms, forms into sheets and gatherings. This is the realm of computational Hinmanism, and largely the terrain that print and probability has been modeling. With enough forensic attention, a single damaged letter becomes traceable across sheets, gatherings, and then, across the threshold, even multiple books. As we move leftward in the diagram, those granular traces begin to accrete. Shared damage, repeated skeleton forms, and shifts in paper tone start to suggest broader production contexts and coordinated activity. What began with modeling type impressions becomes a new kind of inference engine, capable of reconstructing who printed what, where, and under what constraints. By the time we reach the gray boxes, where authors, publishers, and printers are linked to discrete books, we're back in the territory of Darnton's communications circuit. But that circuit is now grounded in evidence previously deprioritized, the deep material record of the book's construction. And here's what's most striking. The diagram reads in both directions. Bibliographers often start from different ends. Some begin with the artifact. Others begin with ideology, censorship, or political economy. Computational bibliography doesn't ask us to choose. It offers a method for moving between them, for connecting the microscopic to the systemic, the page to the printer, the sort to the state. It builds a bridge not just between Hinman and Darnton, but between ways of thinking that have long been held apart. I'm going to conclude with an extended example. I hope it illustrates the full range of computational bibliography's reach. My starting point is a mystery, a whodunit that at first glance sits quite comfortably on the Hinman side of the spectrum. Who printed Spinoza's theological political treatise in 1689? But the implications extend well into meat and potatoes land. For those not familiar with the period, it's hard to overstate how controversial this book was. Stephen Nadler's monograph has now cemented its reputation as the book forged in hell for its frontal attack on the presumed authority of the church and of the Bible. As Jonathan Israel has written, in the entire history of modern thought, only Marx and Nietzsche have so openly and provocatively repudiated almost the entire belief system of the society around them. Published first in Amsterdam in 1670, under a fake title and attributed to a fictitious printer, the theological political treatise had only been available to elite readers of Latin or continental languages prior to the 1689 London octavo. Still, England's clerical readers of the Latin edition were demonstrably fearful that someone would publish an English translation. When the 1689 version did hit London, any reader of English had access to a work that cast severe doubt on revelation and in which God and nature seemed suspiciously synonymous. They also had to hand a powerful articulation of what the edition's title page conspicuously called the freedom to philosophize. Alert readers would have noticed the irony. Because the freedom to philosophize was, in late 17th century London, more a dream than a practical reality, the octavo's author, translator, and printer all went unnamed. The book's failure to declare its printer was in direct contravention of English licensing laws. which required all parties associated with a book or pamphlet to declare their names. For printers, the penalties for failing to do so could include confiscation of type, paper, and presses, imprisonment, and, in some cases, execution. So who was the forger of this book, Forged in Hell? We know neither the translator nor the publisher, nor their decorative printing ornaments to provide many clues. All we know is that it's a relatively nondescript octavo, printed in 31 sheets of primarily English-sized font, although divided into two styles, one used for 23 sheets and one used for 7 of them. We might assume that the book was printed in London, as the imprint claims, but fake locations were a common strategy for printers of clandestine material. Another strategy possibly at play was dividing the material between or among print shops to distribute risk. As censor Roger Lestrange acknowledged, printers could remain, quote, out of distance of a full discovery where the copy is divided into several houses. We ran the edition through our pipeline for mincing words, ocular OCR, and damage scores, and identified damage and distinctive types. Having noticed the different body type fonts, we ran the copy hosted by the Munich Digitization Center through our IIIF-enabled coloring book tool to get a sense of any anomalous sheets or gatherings. Inspired by Tara Lyon's Shakespeare in Sheets project, we laid out the page images in a way to approximate the book's original imposition using a modified version of the open source software PDF Impose. I started, of course, with one mystery, but I soon discovered I had another related mystery on my hands. Within a few months of the Spinoza volume in 1689, another famous and controversial book appeared, the philosopher John Locke's Two Treatises of Government. Its publisher was well known, but the printer had never been identified. Hoping to discover its printer, we minced the copy hosted by the Internet Archive, recognizing glyphs, assigning damage scores, and building up a profile of damaged type. Having noticed 3 different body type fonts, we ran it through our IIIF-enabled coloring book tool to get a sense of any anomalous sheets or gatherings. We laid out the page images in a way to approximate the book's original imposition. What shortly became clear is that these 2 mysteries were one and the same. It turns out these 2 anonymous octavos are literally printed with the same case of English-sized type. Together, Spinoza and Locke might be said to exemplify the main intellectual strands of Enlightenment secular liberalism. In a very material typographical sense, the radical Enlightenment in England flows from a single English font. Whose font was it? The answer requires nuance, but initial signs pointed in all likelihood to the London printer Robert Everingham. Thanks to recent work identifying Everingham as one of the 2 previously unidentified printers of Shakespeare's 4th folio, we had commissioned from UCLA libraries a high-resolution facsimile of Ralph Brownrigg's 40 Sermons, printed by Everingham in 1685. For that volume, too, we had a considerable number of distinctive and damaged typepieces. In all 3 editions, Spinoza, Locke, and 40 Sermons, there was a damaged N so distinctive that I knew at once it was the same case of type. Additional matching confirmed that several distinctively damaged letters that appear in signatures B through Q of the 2 treatises and B through Q and AA through G of the Theological Political Treatise also appear in the 1685 edition of 40 Sermons, acknowledged by Everingham. So this was it. Robert Everingham was the printer responsible for the English Enlightenment. Not so fast. 40 Sermons is a large edition, and all the matches to Locke and Spinoza came in the latter half, amidst what seems to have been intended as a second volume. How could we be sure Brownrigg's sermons hadn't been shared with another printer? Well, for one thing, both title pages had Robert Everingham's name on them, so that was some indication. But there were countervailing clues, and a lot of them. For example, a T from the Spinoza Preliminaries also appeared in a volume printed in 1694 by a different printer. An anonymously printed 1688 edition called Religion and Reason Adjusted and Accorded also had matching damage type, and Everingham didn't seem to have anything to do with that volume. In fact, the person who entered it into the stationer's register was one Thomas Bradall, an inveterate printer of clandestine Whig materials. Following the daisy chain of large font titling letters, from N's on its title page to N's found in a Protestant account of Catholic intolerance to U's found in that same volume on penal laws matching those in other editions from around that same time, it became increasingly clear that Brattle had almost certainly printed Religion and Reason. Among his acknowledged printing was an aggressive polemical summary of Father Simon's critical history of the Old Testament by John Hampton that, according to Justin Champion, quote, left the reader in no doubt about its purpose in undermining the certainty of Scripture. This was also accompanied by his unacknowledged participation in printing Simon's critical history of the text of the New Testament, a work similarly steeped in biblical skepticism. The typographic and topical overlaps with Spinoza were too extensive to ignore. With all this evidence for Thomas Brattle accumulating then, what about Robert Everingham? There were some clues to be found if we looked past the narrow horizon of the 1680s. In a genealogical flourish worthy of a historical novel, in 1700, Everingham's oldest daughter, Elizabeth, named her first son, Everingham Brattle Rumble, suggesting a deeper and perhaps longer-standing partnership between the two printers. In fact, evidence for Brattle and Everingham printing together could be found as early as 1690, when their two names appeared on the printed votes of the House of Commons. The two had won the Commons' unusual commission to print its votes, unusual because printed votes were seen as limiting politicians' abilities to change their minds and to inhibit negotiations with the Lords. And the two continued to print votes weekly from 1690 through 1692. Early in 1693, a title page included an extra E in votes. It may not be coincidental that the Commons soon found new printers. In 1692, Brattle and Everingham were both listed in the imprint for a sermon titled The Nature and Effects of Superstition. That Everingham and Brattle were printing together in the 1690s helps explain why the type associated with both of them can be found in the Locke and Spinoza editions. But there's still the question of chronology. The tale the imprints tell has their work together beginning in 1690. Imprints notwithstanding, however, their display letters were already commingling in the mid-1680s, indicating a lengthier underground collaboration. Brattle's critical inquiries into various editions of the Bible, for example, includes on its title page a titling E that also appeared throughout the 40 sermons. The intermingling of their fonts may mean the easiest inference is also the likeliest, that in the late months of 1689 and in the early months of 1690, Brattle and Everingham conspired with one another to illegally print what may be the English Enlightenment's two most significant tracts. To Russ Leo's complaint that, quote, while histories of radical materials are often compelling, one is nevertheless left with the feeling that some aspect of this very material history has been omitted, we can now introduce for consideration two fascinating new figures, Thomas Brattle and Robert Everingham. The long-standing methodological dilemma in book history, epitomized by the Hinman-Mackenzie debate, has traditionally forced scholars to choose between meticulously examining individual material objects and exploring broader societal patterns. However, I've argued that computational bibliography offers a profound resolution to this tension, acting as a methodological breakthrough that allows for fluid movement between these scales. We've explored two key strains of this emerging field, computational Hinmanism and computational Darntonism. The true power of computational bibliography lies not in choosing one over the other, but in their intermingling as a new trading zone. Central to this integration is modeling, understood as the heuristic process of building and manipulating simplified representations. Modeling bridges the micro and the macro, allowing researchers to account for patterns that might otherwise go unrecognized. The Print and Probability Project, exemplified by the investigation into the anonymous printers of Spinoza and Locke, powerfully illustrates this dynamic scaling. By mincing words to identify distinctive damaged type impressions, a granular Hinmanesque endeavor, and then algorithmically tracing those across numerous works, we've uncovered a hidden collaboration between printers Robert Everingham and Thomas Brattle, whose stakes arguably include nothing less than the English Enlightenment itself. From the material evidence, we've moved decisively into Darnton's meat and potatoes territory. Ultimately, computational bibliography helps the methodological traffic flow in both directions. We don't have to choose artifact or ideology, but instead computational bibliography provides the tools to connect the microscopic details of the sort to the systemic functions shaping the state, building a bridge not just between Hinman and Darton, but between ways of thinking too long in tension. Thanks very much.
Michael, do we have time for some questions? Okay.
I was just curious about how the system Oculus treats ligatures and what it does with those. I'm sure that question has come up.
Sure, yeah. So it can learn any symbol that is effectively in Unicode. So if the ligature is in Unicode and can be communicated to the program as a sort of possibility, then it can learn that. I will say that it does tend to have some challenges with inferring ligatures. Yeah, it's better on different kinds of sorts.
Is there any work to supplement what you're doing with ornament analysis? One thinks of, for example, the quite amazing work parallel to your own of somebody like Hazel Wilkinson in the UK. Really done great work with fluorons and etc. And I'm wondering how you understand not particular piece of software, but to maybe broaden the scope of your inquiry?
Yeah, thank you for that great question. And I love Hazel's work, and that Fluoron project, now I think it's called Compositor, is just a kind of tremendous resource. And I sort of use it all the time. I think it's wonderful. One of the reasons that we sort of went down the path of looking at type actually was because that already existed, because Hazel was already working on that. And so it made sense to kind of turn our attention in a slightly different direction. One of the kind of notable things about many of the sort of books and pamphlets that we have been working on, though, is that they tend to omit sort of ornaments, precisely because ornaments can be so helpful for identifying a print shop. And so many of the things that we've been looking at are sort of intended to be as sort of plain and non-obtrusive as possible. And woodcut ornaments, obviously go in a different direction. But it would be super cool to be able to kind of integrate the compositor into this workflow. I think there's a lot of possibility there.
Thank you for this deeply challenging and stimulating lecture. So thank you very much indeed. Yeah, it's really great. Thank you.